Welcome to the Locum Strategist podcast. I'm your host, Simon Parsons, and this is the show where we help physicians take control of their skill set and create a life on their own terms by using locum tenens as a way to make that happen. On this episode, I have a very special guest that truly embodies what this show is about. He has used locum tenens work to experience communities and work cultures all across the United States. He works when and where he wants without the burnout and overworking that so many healthcare professionals face. He's also used locum tenens to pay off all of his student loans in less than 3 years. And he's the creator of the Nomadic Pediatrician blog, where he documents his incredible journey. Dr. Trevor Cabrera, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Simon. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited to hear more about your journey. So I gave a glimpse into where you are now, but what I'd love to ask you about is like, how did you end up on this path? I'd love to hear maybe some backstory about medical school and what got you on this path and making some of the choices that you do right now.
Yeah, it is so interesting. I sometimes people still ask me like why I decided to be a doctor, and I think you have to go back to that root sometimes when you're figuring out how you end up at this point. And other times, you just end up somewhere and then you don't really know how that happened. No, I think like a lot of people, I went into medical school thinking I want to help people, save people at XYZ. I liked science. I was fascinated with all those things, like a lot of people were. After medical school, I got interested in the field of pediatrics because I felt that kids had a lot of clean slates, that they weren't at fault for anything they did. And it really was kind of, I think, the passion and motivation that got me into medicine. But I think one way that a lot of people now think of the path is really towards like the end goal. I mean, you go to school and you just think, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to go to school, and you accept at some point that training is going to take over at least 10 years of your life. And so you go through those different steps, and then after your residency training, you hit that point where all of a sudden you're done and you finally got to the end of the road, so to speak. And at that point, it's kind of like your life just is just beginning. And for some people, I think they have very clear goals on what's going to happen after that. But I would venture guess that myself, along with many others out there now, we get to a point where we get there and we actually don't know what comes after that. So for me, going through pediatric residency, I had to think about during training what I liked and also what I wanted to do afterwards. I learned very quickly that there were things that I did like and did not like. And by that, I mean certain specialties. I did not like working in clinics. I liked working in the hospital. And it kind of gave me like an unclear idea of what I wanted to do when I was done. And so when I was in my second or third year of residency, I had heard about this thing called Locum Tenens. An agency had come to talk to our program, and I didn't really quite know much about what it was. But then I got to that, proverbial kind of end of the road when I was about to graduate residency. And because I didn't have a clear idea of where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do, and I had this enormous mortgage of a debt hanging over my head, I went back to that conversation about locum tenens and kind of thought a little bit more about it. And really, after that, just dove like headfirst straight into it. So I think that's kind of where it starts. And I think when I look back, I don't, I don't think I would have done anything different, and I'm glad I went that way.
Did you, so have you been doing straight locums since you've graduated residency?
Yeah. And so when I graduated residency in July of 2020, I decided immediately to do just straight locums, only locums. I didn't even have a part-time permanent job, and I actually, honestly, took a huge risk. Um, Particularly for me, when I finished residency, was right in the middle of COVID, and ironically, in the pediatric population, in the pediatric world, there was less patients and there were less jobs during COVID. While people saw the adult side of medicine explode and all the news reports of all the catastrophic things that happened with adults, kids stayed home. They didn't go around other kids and get sick. And when they were healthy, they weren't taken to the doctor just to because I think parents wanted to avoid taking their kid to a place that there were other sick kids. And long story short, while the field of locum tenens traditionally has more needs and more demand than supply of providers, during COVID it was the reverse. And so when I finished, not only was I a new graduate, I'd just become a new attending. Not only was I trying to figure out from a clinical space where I was and how I was going to practice and the autonomy of medical decision making, but I also was trying to navigate a job market that was slighted totally against me. I mean, during that time, there were outpatient pediatricians that went bankrupt and had to close their practices because the volumes dropped so much. So when I finished, when I was looking into locum jobs, instead of me being one physician looking through 20 jobs, I was one of 20 physicians, like basically battling it out for one job. And so I'll tell you that when I did that, I took some strategic risks financially in order to make that happen. I intentionally saved up enough money to allow myself to float by for a couple of months, and then actually, uh, and this is something I think that took a lot of, well, I think it took some guts. Because of the paucity, I think is the only word I can use to accurately describe it. But because of the paucity of work, I actually lived paycheck to paycheck for several months after finishing residency. I mean, imagine that, like being a brand new attending doctor. I've got friends that graduated and they doubled their resident salary. Some of them maybe tripled it. I don't know. And I am there living month to month off of these small jobs. And at my first job, one thing I did was I intentionally, the way it works with locums is you can work on negotiating your rate. And at my very first job, I intentionally went in at the lower rate. And what happened was I beat out all the other providers because I was the cheapest, right? They hired me, they got to like me, and then we went up on the rate, but they kept me. And that actually was one of the big first moves I did. I took one step back to make two steps forward. And, you know, all to be said that when I decided to go straight into locums, yeah, I decided to commit fully to doing it. I was all in, and it got to some points where it was a little unclear. I mean, after 6 or 7 months of being paycheck to paycheck, but still having loan payments to make, I wasn't really sure if I was going to make it. But I held the course. I just committed that I'm going to go all in for this, and by about February of 2021, about was that maybe 8 9 months after I graduated, or maybe a little bit less than that, the job started to recover, and I started getting more jobs that stack on one another, and I was able to completely let loose.
Dr. Cabrera, I want to hear the story about how you paid off your student loans using locum tenens work.
I love talking about paying off loans, and I love talking about that part of the sacrifice that we make when we go into medicine. Um, I like to start by saying in the United States, the average student loans that people will take on from going to medical school are somewhere between, I believe I've heard anywhere between 300 and $500,000. And that is assuming not even undergraduate loans or anything like that. So for me, when I graduated from residency, um, I had about $315,000 in loans, which is a significant amount given that is probably double the average salary for most general pediatricians, which is what I was trained to do right out of residency. Um, Now, once again, that's a difference of being in the clinic versus in the hospital, but to not digress, I think one of the biggest pieces of advice, which is passed along to everybody now, and I think people become much more cognizant of it. There's online blogs and online conversations all the time about this on more more financial literacy than there was before. But one thought that has kind of gone into the medical community is this idea that when you're finished with residency, you need to live like a resident for a number of years. And it's very easy to get caught up in this crazy situation where, I mean, general pediatricians, when we finish residency, our salary does not multiply as much as some specialties like surgery, but it still grows a lot. And you're growing from a five-figure salary into like these crazy six-figure salaries. And what happens is people will grow into it really quickly. I think that's like a common sense kind of statement, right? So for me, number one, I did the common thing, which is I lived like a resident. I try not to eat out too much. I was fairly cheap about things. I also got to a point where I didn't need a lot, but the things that made me different and the things that really carved out I guess, um, my own name that I gave myself as the nomadic pediatrician was that in February of 2021, when I did start to get more consistent locum work and I was no longer living paycheck to paycheck, I actually canceled my lease for my apartment. I sold 80, 90% of everything I had. I put some things back in storage at my mom's house in California. And then I got one and a half suitcases and as little as I needed. And I started to travel and do locums work nonstop. When I was still living in my apartment, I would work somewhere along the lines of a couple days, a week, or month, and I would commute from my apartment to the job. If the job was not near my apartment, I might stay in the hotel in that little town for that stretch, but then I would always come back to that apartment. What I did though instead in February was I started on this path of working jobs that began to tail themselves to one another. And so from February 2021 until July of 2023, I worked jobs tail to tail. I stacked them one after another. And by doing that, if you think about the savings from an apartment, I mean, I think right there I saved at least $25,000 depending on, I guess your rent, because I wasn't paying for rent. On top of that, locum agencies were reimbursing me and paying for my hotel stays, my rental car, my airfare. So I had no expenses there either. I mean, just when you think about how much you're saving from that standpoint alone, it's absolutely um, ridiculous, I guess. So I wasn't making car payments, I wasn't paying for gas, and without rent and everything, the main things that I paid for were really food and whatever I wanted to do for fun, right? And so ultimately, I found that not only did the salary that I made just as a pure hourly difference as a locum versus a permanent provider, not only was that largely, you know, hugely different. But on top of that, wasn't spending very much. So during those couple of years, I did the math, and I spent about 8 to 10% of my entire salary on anything. That's including my disability insurance. That's including my um, car insurance, which you still have to have if you're renting. But considering all of that, only 8 to 10% of my entire income was spent on those things. And that income was much more than a general pediatrician because of the nature of it being locum tenens work in the first place. So when you put all that together, I was making more and I was spending less than anybody else. And when you do that, I mean, I think that's what we all strive for, right? When you do that and you have priorities of where you do want to put that extra money, um, it can really work out pretty nicely. So I decided to direct all of it towards well, I decided to direct all of my money towards first maxing out my retirement plan and then the rest of it paying down my loan. And I actually did it to the point that, to be honest with you, I probably could have paid off my entire student loan within 1 or 2 years, but I decided to stretch it out for 3 years. Big difference, right? But for 3 years, just so that I could be smart and savvy about having some sort of, I guess, nest egg or something to fall back on.
That is brilliant. So you were making more money than you would have in a permanent job. You didn't have the expenses that a normal person would have as far as housing and transportation, and you were able to max out your retirement accounts for those years and pay off your student loans within 3 years. Is that correct?
That's correct. And then one thing that I definitely have to mention is that what people don't always realize is that the way the United States is established for our jobs and the way taxes work, I think that foundationally, regardless of your own opinions or your beliefs on one side or the other, the government and the IRS are set up to uh, really reward people that do small business kind of endeavors. And what I'm trying to say by that is you are given a purely a higher allowance for savings if you're an independent contractor. I mean, and that was what I loved about it. I was an independent contractor, so unlike normally we talk about Roth IRAs or 401ks. I was doing self-employment IRAs or solo 401ks, and those gave me the ability to also kind of work some tax shelters in from a different angle. So that added even more depth to that big differential there, that big delta, I would say, between my spending and earning.
Yeah, that is brilliant. I mentioned this on a podcast episode recently about the self-employed pension and the single a person 401k, where you can put away, I think, about $60,000 away, up to 25% of your income. I am so glad to actually meet somebody who would max that out. I remember doing something similar earlier in my career. Now, after you've gotten that paid off, I know you've got a fellowship on the horizon, but financially, how are you setting yourself up now that you've paid off your loans so quickly? Most people probably take at least a decade to pay off their student loans. You've got that all taken care of. You've been putting money away. What else are you doing to set yourself up financially for success? And what's the reasoning behind it? I'm sure it has something to do with giving yourself flexibility and freedom in the future as well.
Well, I think I got to a point of trying to redesign the box or the wheel that I think I'm inside of. I think we've talked before about this, but I think I got to a point where I'm not trying to think outside the box anymore. I got to a point of questioning whether there is a box. And that sounds so maybe silly and just metaphysical, but it really has been the concept I'm living with. And so to make that more related to, to answer that question, I think we are all set up to most traditionally, you buy things, you're going to take on some credit or some debt for whatever you buy, you're going to slowly pay that back. For example, you get a car, you have car payments, you get a house, you've got mortgage payments. And I think, for most people, that's going to be what we have to do. But by the way that I functioned as a locums, with all of that saving, what I effectively ended up doing was I paid off those loans. I ended up saving an equal amount. And then when it came towards me actually settling into an apartment, which I'm in right now, as you can see, when I settled into an apartment for fellowship and I had to get a car, I bought it in cash. And so that was something that I'm aware that not everybody may be capable of doing that right away, but I focused on those being my priorities. So instead of going farther into debt and having, buying a house just to have a house and really offset my assets and my liabilities in that way, I focus a different direction. And so personally, I'm hoping to do that similar sort of thought, and that's how I try to think of my life and have money working for me, right? As some people would say, versus me working for money. That's something that I'm trying to think about. So some ways that I'm setting myself up right now. Um, you're right. I am back in fellowship to be a neonatologist now. It's 3 years of fellowship, and I took about a 70 to 80% pay cut from being a locum tenens provider to coming back to training. There's a lot of questions I give people on whether or not that was a good idea. And, short answer is I don't know. I mean, I love what I do and that's why I'm here. And it wasn't about the money. But one thing that I thought about was, hey, I put all this money into my SEP IRA, which is a, non taxed investment account right now. my tax bracket for this past year, because I did locums for a while and then came out to fellowship, is still fairly high. So converting it to a Roth or doing a backdoor is probably not the best idea. But I have a good financial advisor, and plus or minus, if you like to use one or work for yourself on it. Myself, I learn a lot from them, and it helps me. I do stuff on my own too for fun. But my financial advisor made a good point, which is, you're taking that 80% pay cut for 3 years. So I put all that money into my SEP, and actually in 2025, I plan on doing a huge backdoor Roth because my tax bracket is going to be actually much lower then than it might actually be in 40 years from now. I don't know. So it's kind of interesting. That was an well, a little bit of an intentional, but also slightly unintended, like sequelae of everything that just happened to line up. Um, I do think that the concept of investments is definitely something I'm still learning, and I'm aware that I am still a novice at that. But I think that's definitely something that I think about more now. So I guess the biggest way to sum that up is I would say I think about money and its role and where I need to use it or what I want it to do for me much differently and much more now than I did several years ago. When I finished residency, my thought was I want to pay off my loans in 10 years. Maybe I'll do the public service loan forgiveness. And then someone said, "Oh, I'm not doing that." And I thought they were stupid. I said, "Why aren't you doing loan forgiveness?" And they said, "You don't need loan forgiveness if you pay it off." And I thought that's absolutely crazy. Why would I do that? And you look at the numbers, and I realized, okay, I could do it. So when I finished residency in 2020, my thought was maybe I'll have a good job. I'm gonna go along the path that everyone has. I'll eventually get a car and maybe a house, or maybe maybe I'll get married, XYZ, and I will not be a millionaire, but I will be comfortable and I will just go along with things. Now, 2023, I talked to my financial advisor like a couple months ago, and I was like, "Hey, Will, that's how I thought in 2020. Now I'm talking flying first class in Emirates one of these days. I have changed vastly where I want to go because I realize I can go so much farther than I ever thought. But I didn't know that until I took a risk to do it, and that risk paid off and like opened the doors that now I'm kind of more open to that risk. Um, I'm also honestly I'm in a good position where I can be very aggressive. I'm not very risk averse right now because I don't have a whole lot to lose since I've got no debt.
I think that I love what you said about thinking out of the box. And I don't think that that's just like cookie cutter. I think that's a real thing because we have these constructs, we have these paradigms and these ways of thinking, and we end up working within those boxes. And what I love about you sharing here is you're giving people new ideas, and somebody gave you that idea to start thinking out of the box, and you're passing that on. So I really appreciate that. I was on your blog and I saw a really cool article that you wrote about the 5 reasons why you do locums. And I'm sure there's been some unexpected surprises, some benefits that you didn't count on, but you listed freedom, experience, compensation. One thing that you mentioned on there was community as well. The two that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about is what do you mean by that? What do you mean by freedom? How do you describe freedom? What has locums unlocked for you? And tell me a little bit more about the relationships and the community or the people that you've met on your journeys.
That's a great question, Simon. So first of all, from a standpoint of freedom, I think what I mean is autonomy. I think with the idea of freedom was autonomy of making my own schedule. I had the freedom to take jobs I wanted to take and not do things I didn't want to do. I have, for the last several months now, been in a more stable part of training in a more established traditional practice setting, have just listened to a lot of people um, daily have frustrations on their schedule, on them being moved from one place to the next, of not having the control over some of those days off or days on, the fact that they have to balance things out to, um, they have to fit their life into their job. I fit my job into my life. That's really good, by the way. I never said that before. But I think that sounds really good. um, but yeah, so I think that from the freedom standpoint, it was really nice. I got to go where I wanted to go. I got to do what I wanted to do. If I didn't want to work, I didn't have to work. Now, I'll tell you, I worked 22, 23 days a month, and that was my choice. But I have a really good friend that does locums, and she works 1 week a month. She travels the other 3 weeks, is either staying with her boyfriend or going to other countries. I think she went to Peru several months ago. And so it just was really nice to have that control over those kind of administrative details. On top of that, I was honestly a little bit removed from the hospital administration issues. All of the BS of the nitty gritty things of productivity that they force on everyone else, they didn't quite apply to me being there. I would go into a job, I would do the job, and I would leave, and I didn't have to go to meetings. I didn't have to deal with, making the system, making the hospital work a certain way. I just had to do my work and take care of patients like I wanted to do, and everything else was really not my problem. Um, and so that's I guess where I'd say on the freedom part of it. And then, sorry, your next question was on
Next one
community.
was about connection. So you're moving around the US, like you basically a digital nomad for a while, and you're being put in these new communities, these new hospitals, these new cultures. And you listed one of the five reasons why you enjoy locums is the connection. And I'm sure adventure could be part of this too. But tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me about the impact that you made it, and maybe a moment where you really have felt like you've made a difference in somebody's life, or maybe the community or the people that you've worked with. But talk a little bit about the connection that you have found through locums.
I think this is really important, and I cannot emphasize enough that the connotations that people have towards locum tenens as being a job that is done by misfits or people that cannot hold a stable job is really something that should be challenged and kind of revisited. It's different in practice and for the people that do it. So that being said, um, I was given the opportunity and my personality fit integrating into multiple different communities, integrating into multiple different groups of people all over the country, and also being able to give care to people in those areas. Um, and so I guess I'd say, like, while people think that I would just go into a job and not care and leave, I went into a job giving 100% every time. And when you do that, it is inevitably hard not to get attached to the people there. And if you put enough work into it and you're interested in those people, it also pays dividends back. So I can tell you, I mean, my first job was in this town, Huntsville, Texas, about an hour north of Houston, where I did my training. I'm still friends with a lot of the nurses that I worked with in the labor and delivery unit. Dr. Montgomery, the OBGYN, taught me how to do circumcisions there. It's a town of 22,000 people. And when I was there, I went to the same coffee shop for all those weekends, got to know them, and they gave me free coffee by the time I'd been there for a couple of months. I moved on and I went to a job in New Mexico where I was the only pediatrician for 60 miles. Still to this day, I talked to all my Filipino nurses back there that invited me out to karaoke with them, of course, or to their house for food. I remember when I was there, I diagnosed a kid that came to clinic with something called infantile spasms. It's a very bad neurologic like declining condition, and I recognized it, was concerned enough, sent them to a hospital an hour and a half away on a hunch that they had this condition, and I was correct. And they came back and they were so grateful that I'd been there. And I wonder forever, if it had been someone else there, would they have caught it? And I'm not saying that I'm that great, and there's a lot of things that I might miss, but some reason I caught that, and in a deeper kind of meaning, I was in the right place at the right time for some sort of reason, and that worked out. And then, other times I was in Wisconsin, and when I was in Wisconsin, La Crosse, Wisconsin, I worked with a neonatologist there that is still someone that I look to as a mentor that's given me some ideas on research that I'm doing. When I was in Maine, And I think Maine is probably the biggest state that I would talk about for all of this. When I was in Maine, I was at the same hospital in central Maine for a year and a half, and I did that job linked and kind of bouncing between there and other places all over the country. But when I was at that job, I got to know the nurses and the hospital pediatricians and the staff there so well. To this day, some of the family medicine residents that I worked with and trained still like will message me and say hi. I ran into some of the hospitalists that I worked with there when I was at the American Academy Pediatric National Convention. And literally earlier today, one of my nurses sent me a pic from Maine that I haven't seen in several months. Sent me a picture of her kid and said, "Hey, my new baby had this happen. Like, what do you think's going on?" So I think if you are allowing yourself to really give your all to a job, you can integrate into the society of the hospital, the community, and the entire area. And you have to be the person that wants to try to do that, but it can be very rewarding. So, you know, at this point, I would say from the 10 states I was in, I just I have friends in all of them that I still keep in touch with, and I feel like I've been able to provide care to some of the kids in those situations and families. And who's to say that maybe someone else that was there could have done the same thing? Maybe not. That's always the question. I helped, we had a baby that was delivered in Maine that had a spinal cord problem, and we had to transfer that baby to the bigger hospital right away for surgery. And it was unexpected for them to deliver at our hospital. It wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to deliver at the bigger hospital, but we were the closer hospital. They came to us first, hoping to get transferred before the baby was born. Her mom hoped to get transferred, but she didn't make it because she started going into labor. So she delivered the baby. My group and I had gotten to know each other so well, and we had never delivered a baby with this condition at that hospital. It has never been done. At least from what I know, it had never been done. And so we got together. I said, Deb, Kelly, look, we haven't done this before. Let's figure out how we're going to do this safely. It's hard to describe all the details unless you're there. But long story short, for this kind of baby, this kind of delivery, we had to have extra resources in the delivery room to make sure that the baby would stay safe and not get infected, things along those natures. And we were all kind of freaking out, but we had gotten to know each other so well. We knew how to function off of each other as a team. The baby was born. We wrapped the baby up and wrapped up the spinal cord in the way that you're supposed to. And the baby got transferred to the bigger hospital, got surgery. And I think like a month or two later, the parents came back in and said, that night we were so scared, but it was we felt so much more calm when you were there. Um, and I don't know, like I said, if someone else could have been in the same situation, what would have happened? But I have taken each of those experiences and really try to cement them and ingrain them in myself as kind of the mosaic of who I am now. All these mixtures of different experiences, different people, and I do feel that that's like for me kind of a big community, big interconnected pool there. Um, so, not to be too trite, but I think that that's really I kind of feel what the contribution has been.
That's a beautiful story. Trevor, I have one more question for you that I think is kind of a cool one. Another way that you've been able to use locums to your advantage. How did you travel hack going to Europe?
Yeah, travel hacking, and I'm a beginner at travel hacking, but there are a lot of cool things that I learned. There are so many people that work on points now, and you think about credit cards and these ways of doing all these big things that I'm still learning about, but started to really focus on a lot more in the last couple of years. So I think when I started, the big thing is that locum agencies, because they will reimburse you for a lot of things you pay for, It's a way of getting free points for things and not spending money to do it, so to speak. So, in other words, a lot of my jobs, I stayed in Hiltons or I stayed in Marriott's. And so, of course, you have your Hilton Honors, your Marriott Bonvoy loyalty, that you set up. And so I thought, what if I get a credit card that is a Hilton credit card that pays me 12 times the points every time I use it? And I pay for the hotel that I'm staying at the Hilton, but then I send that receipt to the agency and they reimburse me for the cost. Versus sometimes, the agencies will just pay for it directly. And at the beginning, I let them do that because I didn't think about it. And then I talked to one of my recruiters and said, "Wait a second. If either way the agency is going to pay for it, is there a difference in them paying the money back to the hotel or just back to me?" And he said, "It doesn't make a difference." And so when I started to do that, I mean, let's say that I stayed at a Hilton for 10 days in a row and that stay itself is worth like 10,000 points. Well, I also had a credit card that had a 12 times multiplier on it. I also, would spend that card, and those nights together would add up even more because just counting the nights I stayed there. And then I would send the bills to the agencies, get reimbursed, and I'd walk away with 50,000 Hilton points from whatever stay that was. And then when you think about the fact that I lived out of a suitcase for 2.5 years and you multiply all those numbers out, I mean, I probably spent around 600 nights in hotels in the last couple years. Some people think that that's like a little bit insane, but I stayed in a lot of extended stays. So the hotel I stayed in Maine, I mean, I had a little kitchen, I had a little stovetop that I could use to cook with, and I mean, I made lobster risotto in a hotel. So I did okay as far as still enjoying what I like to do from eating standpoints because I'm a big foodie. But also, I accumulated after a couple years something like 3.5 million Hilton points. Um, and if you think about the average stay for a good place, maybe 40, 50,000 Hilton points. I mean, I'm going into the details for you because yes, I mean when you do that math, it ends up being a lot of free time. So when I decided to go back to fellowship, I took a whole month off and said I'm going to go to Europe. I've accumulated all of these points. Oh, and you know what? If I didn't have a credit card attached to the hotel, let's say it was a car rental, well, I'd pay for that with my Chase Sapphire or my American Express, and that's how I would get points to pay for flights on top of it. So, I got like I would get one of the Chase Sapphire card. I hit the opening bonus for it because you had to spend a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time. And then all of a sudden I had like 70,000 Chase points and figured, okay, well, I guess I'll pay for my flight to Europe and just for kicks, I guess I can fly first class back from Europe and just use the points. And so I did that. And so I went to Europe for 30 days, fully funded on the points. And I stayed in some like nice hotels all over. I was not doing this as a 20-year-old that's staying at a $5 hostel. Not anymore, right? I mean, it was pretty cool. I was in Amsterdam, I was in Paris, Porto, Portugal. I went to three different places in Spain, including the coast of Malaga and Barcelona. I ended with London, and then I took a flight back. And when I did the math, I think that I most likely, if I had paid cash, probably would have spent around $10,000 on the hotels, and that was saved by these points. And so I would say, like, I think from a travel hacking standpoint, to really just make that a very salient, more summarized point, I take advantage of credit cards and opening bonuses. I take advantage of stacking points and like multipliers of credit cards and really paying attention to the deals. And then also the ability to understand the transferring, the way that points can transfer from a credit card to an airline or from one airline to another, which is a whole other deeper conversation. But those are things that I started to look into. Um, and because you said the words travel hack. I will give you an actual travel hack that I think is very important as a side note. So that's my trip in Europe. But as a total side note, after traveling so much, I learned this, and I had to use this trick a couple weeks ago, actually. But for anybody listening to this, or maybe for yourself too, if this ever happens, every now and then, if you are flying into a city that is very busy, the weather's really bad, for example, which is what happened to me when I came to Kansas City after Thanksgiving. I got to the airport and I was unable to find an Uber or a Lyft for under $100. Usually it's like 20 bucks. And the reason is that when you go to the airport, people don't always know this, but for all these ride shares like Uber and Lyft or anything else, they always have to pay some sort of fee to the airport for the ride share to go there to pick someone up. So they're always able to charge more. And so, a little travel hack that I've used a couple times is I get to the airport, I'll get on a free shuttle to any of the local hotels. And I mean, they don't always ask you, but if you call the Uber or you call the rideshare from the hotel and not the airport, it's cheaper all the time. And it's also easy. Yeah, it's also easier to get a ride. So when this happened to me a couple weeks ago, there was actually, I think, people waiting outside for an hour at the airport trying to get a ride, and the apps just weren't picking anything up. I took a shuttle to like the local Marriott and immediately got a ride. But anyways,
That's brilliant. I
so
love it. Well, thank you for sharing that story.
sorry,
Any
that's off
last
topic,
words?
but
No, I love it. I could go on forever, but I want to be respectful of your time. Any last words to somebody who is listening to this podcast and they've had thoughts about doing locums? They're overworked, they're working 60, 70 hours, but they're not quite sure. Any last words of advice?
I think some of the most important things to think about for anybody that is going into medicine is really, why did you go into medicine, and to remember why you did that. And when you think of those things and what makes you happy, to focus on those things to really keep you along the right path. But then also, once you figured all that out, realize that you can balance the rest of your life, and you can have a life that can incorporate your job into it versus the other way around. So I think my biggest point of advice for anybody that's interested or curious about locum tenens, anybody that's burnt out, anybody that's looking for a change, something to make their life more interesting, or to diversify their portfolio or their scope of practice, or to widen and broaden their experience, you should take the jump and look into and just take the jump and do it. Um, that's the biggest advice I would say is anybody that has asked me about locum tenens, I always just say do it. It is simple, and that's really, I have no regrets about anything I've done. It has been a world that I never thought existed. It has changed my life, and it can change yours.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love how you went on a trip to Europe before your fellowship. That's just like the big bow on everything. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your experiences, and also telling us about the lives that you've made an impact in. For the audience, I would love it if you would follow his blog. It is the nomadicpediatrician.com. I'm going to put that in the show notes. Please share that with any of your colleagues. It is inspiring and just fun journey, fun to follow his journey.